Stolen generations. The stolen generations refers to children of Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islander descent who were forcibly removed from their families by Australian federal and state government agencies and church missions under acts of their respective parliaments between approximately 1869 and 1969. Beat generation. The Beat generation refers to a popular American cultural movement widely cited by social scholars as having laid the foundation of the proactive American counterculture of the 1960s. It consisted of Americans born between the two world wars who came of age in the rise of the automobile era and the surrounding accessibility they brought to the culturally diverse yet geographically broad and separated nation. Generation Jones. Generation Jones is a term coined by Jonathan Pontel to describe the cohort of people born between 1954 and 1965. The term is used primarily in English-speaking countries. Pontel defined Generation Jones as referring to the second half of the post-World War II baby boom. The term also includes first-wave Generation X, MTV Generation, a term referring to the adolescents and young adults of the 1980s and early mid-1990s who were heavily influenced by the MTV television channel. It is often used synonymously with Generation X, Generation of 500. Generation of 500 is a term popularized by the Greek mass media and refers to educated Greek twixters of urban centers who generally fail to establish a career. Young adults are usually forced into underemployment in temporary and occasional jobs, unrelated to their educational background, and receive the minimum allowable base salary of Euro 500. This generation evolved in circumstances leading to the Greek debt crisis and participated in the 2010-2011 Greek protests. Scraping by generation. In Portugal, they are called the scraping by generation, a twist on the older term, the lousy generation, used by detractors to refer to student demonstrations in the 1990s against education ministers Antonio Couto dos Santos and later Manuela Ferreira Leite. Xennials. Xennials, Oregon Trail Generation, and Generation Catalano are terms used to describe individuals born during Generation X millennial cusp years. Xennials is a portmanteau blending the words Generation X and Millennials to describe a micro-generation of people born from the late 1970s to early 1980s. Zillennials, Zillennials, Xennials, Snapchat Generation, and Minion Z are terms used to describe individuals born during the Millennial Generation Z cusp years. Zillennials is a portmanteau blending the words Millennials and Generation Z to describe a micro-generation of people born from the early 1990s to the early 2000s. In Armenia, people born after the country's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991 are known as the Independence Generation. In Bulgaria, people born in the final years of communism and early years of capitalism, mid-1980s to mid-1990s, are known as the children of the transition. They are believed to have had a difficult time adapting to the many changes in the country that occurred during the time they were growing into adulthood. Regime and economic changes and shifts from Eastern to Western cultural values and influences, among other factors, were things their parents, being from previous generations, could not prepare them for. In the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the generation of people born in Czechoslovakia during the baby boom, which started in the early 1970s, during the period of normalization, are called Husak's children. The generation was named after the president and long-term communist leader of Czechoslovakia, Gustav Husak. This was due to his political program to boost the growth of population. In the People's Republic of China, the post-80s are those who were born in the 1980s in urban areas of mainland China. Growing up in modern China, the post-80s has been characterized by its optimism for the future, newfound excitement for consumerism and entrepreneurship, and acceptance of its historic role in transforming modern China into an economic power. There is also the similarly named post-90s, those born in the post-Tiananmen era of the 1990s. A broader generational classification would be the one-child generation born between the introduction of the one-child policy in 1980 and its softening into a two-child policy in 2013. The lack of siblings has had profound psychological effects on this generation, such as egoism due to always being at the center of parents' attention, as well as the stress of having to be the sole provider once the parents retire. People born post-80s in Hong Kong are for the most part different from the same generation in mainland China. The term post-80s came into use in Hong Kong between 2009 and 2010, particularly during the opposition to the Guangzhou-Hong Kong Express Rail link, during which a group of young activists came to the forefront of Hong Kong's political scene. They are said to be post-materialist in outlook, and they are particularly vocal in issues such as urban development, culture and heritage, and political reform. Their campaigns include the fight for the preservation of Lee Tung Street, the Star Ferry Pier, and the Queen's Pier, Choi Yuen Tsuen Village, real political reform on the 23rd of June, and a citizen-oriented Kowloon West Art District. Their discourse mainly develops around themes such as anti-colonialism, sustainable development, and democracy. In Hungary, the recriminalization of abortion and the childless tax policies implemented by Anna Ratko in the early 1950s resulted in a minor baby boom, roughly 1953-1956, known as the Ratko era or the Ratko children. In India, generations tend to follow a pattern similar to the broad Western model, although there are still major differences, especially in the older generations. One interpretation sees India's independence in 1947 as India's major generational shift. People born in the 1930s and 1940s tended to be loyal to the new state and tended to adhere to traditional divisions of society. Indian boomers, those born after independence and into the early 1960s, witnessed events like the Indian emergency between 1975 and 1977, which made a number of them somewhat skeptical of the government. In Israel, where most Ashkenazi Jews born before the end of World War II were Holocaust survivors, children of survivors and people who survived as babies are sometimes referred to as the second generation of Holocaust survivors. This term is particularly common in the context of psychological, social, and political implications of the individual and national transgenerational trauma caused by the Holocaust. Some researchers have also found signs of trauma in third-generation Holocaust survivors. In Northern Ireland, people born after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, generally regarded as the end of the Troubles, are colloquially known as peace babies. In Norway, the term the desert generation has been applied to the baby boomers and every generation afterwards. In Russia, characteristics of Russian generations are determined by fateful historical events that significantly change either the foundations of the life of the country as a whole or the rules of life in a certain period of time. Names and given descriptions of Russian generations: the generation of winners, the generation of the Cold War, the generation of perestroika, the first non-Soviet generation, the digital generation. In Singapore, people born before 1949 are referred to as the pioneer generation for their contributions to Singapore during the nation's earliest years. Likewise, those born between 1950 and 1959 are referred to as the Merdeka generation, as their formative years were during the political turbulence of the 1950s to 1960s in Singapore. In South Africa, people born after the 1994 general election, the first after apartheid was ended, are often referred to in media as the born-free generation. People born after the year 2000 are often referred to as AMA 2000, a term popularized by music and a Coca-Cola advert. In South Korea, generational cohorts are often defined around the democratization of the country, with various schemes suggested including names such as the Democratization Generation, 386 Generation, named after Intel 386 computer in the 1990s to describe people in their late 30s and early 40s who were born in the 1960s and attended University College in the 1980s, also called the June 3, 1987 generation, that witnessed the June Uprising, the April 19th generation, that struggled against the Syngman Rhee regime in 1960, the June 3rd generation, that struggled against the Normalization Treaty with Japan in 1964, the 1969 generation, that struggled against the constitutional revision allowing 3 presidential terms, and the Shinseidai, new generation. The term Shinseidai generation refers to the generation following millennials in the Korean language. The Shinseidai generation are mostly free from ideological or political bias. In Sweden, it is common to talk about people based on the decades of their births. 40-tailist, a person that was born in the 1940s. 50-tailist, a person that was born in the 1950s, etc. In Taiwan, the term strawberry generation refers to Taiwanese people born after 1981 who bruise easily like strawberries, meaning they cannot withstand social pressure or work hard like their parents' generation. The term refers to people who are insubordinate, spoiled, selfish, arrogant, and sluggish in work. In Turkey, it is common to talk about people based on the decades of the time they were teens. In Spain, although in general terms there is a certain assimilation to the generational structure of Strauss and Howe, and uncritically the majority of the media use it, there are substantial differentials for historical reasons that, as established by the generations theory, have marked the successive age cohorts in the century 15th. Firstly, neutrality during the First World War, which prevented it from suffering that social and cultural impact. Secondly, the Civil War and the subsequent dictatorship, which lasted 4 decades and, especially during its first decades, imposed strong political, social, and cultural repression. And thirdly, neutrality during World War II. Thus, the sociologists Artemio Baigorri and Manuela Caballero insert between the silent generation and the baby boom generation, which they also call the protest generation, what they call the Franco generation, 1929-1943, whose childhood and early youth was marked by war, post-war scarcity, and repression.